Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do a book haul revisit. This is where I look back at book hauls from previous years in this month and see how many of those books I have read, how many I might have unhauled, and see if there are any that I might still want to read and maybe start thinking about book haul unhauls. And it's a way of keeping myself accountable for the books I purchase and bring into my library. Usually there hasn't been a bad degree of success in recent book haul revisits. This one is going to be a little bit bleak. Let's get into it. So before we begin, I should mention that there are going to be 4 years of book hauls I'm going to look at. But for timing purposes, I'm not really going to spend a lot of time talking about what each book is about. The original book haul video will be linked in the description box down below. If you would like more information about a book, I recommend you go there because I spend a lot of time talking about what each book is about and all of that good stuff in the original book haul, so check those out. So we're going to start with the most recent book hauls, and we're going to go back in time and take a journey. So that, of course, means we're going to start with April of 2022. And the first book that I brought into my library then was True Biz by Sara Nović. This is a book that I have not read yet. Spoiler alert, everything from 2022 is going to be a big 0. And this is in that wheelhouse. I still really want to read this book. I've had some good feedback on it. And there is a prompt on Montana Book Company's reading challenge for 2023 that involves reading a book either by a deaf author or featuring deaf characters. And this would meet that prompt. So I'm hoping that I will actually read this book this year and then have more to talk about. So yeah, I haven't gotten to it, but I'm hoping I will soon. The next one is Devotion by Hannah Kent, which I don't know if you can see in the light, but has this really subtle foil on the cover that shimmers in a kind of delightful way when you move it around. This was something that I had seen Jen the librarian talk about on her channel. I ordered a copy from the UK, and I haven't gotten around to reading it yet. Part of that is that feedback on it was that it's a little emotionally devastating, or maybe a lot emotionally devastating. And events of the last year have made it so that I'm not at the level or prepared for something that is emotionally devastating. And that is what it is. So this book has still been on my radar. It is still something I would like to read. The jacket does jump out at me from the shelf a fair amount, but I haven't gotten to it yet, and I don't know when I will, based on that emotionally devastating aspect of it. I would still like to read it. It's not going to go anywhere, but I haven't gotten to it yet. And then we have Brickmakers by Selva Almada, translated from the Spanish by Annie McDermott. Have not gotten to this one either. Again, everything from 2022 is something that I have not managed to read yet, and this is no exception. It's a slim little thing, so hopefully I should manage to fit it in at some point soon. I admit there's a little bit less urgency on this one now, a year later, than there was at the time, and I would definitely prioritize some other books in this haul before I would get to this one, including both of the ones I've already talked about and some of the, pretty much all of the remaining ones. But that just really goes to show that I want to read all of the books in this book haul. It's just a matter of getting to them. So hopefully I will manage to do that soon. Next is The Blackwater Lightship by Colm Tóibín. I have had an interesting journey. I was wondering what my first Colm Tóibín book was going to be, and I keep changing my mind, and I think it's probably going to be this one, and we'll see how that goes, because I haven't managed to do it yet. It's a natural fit for my Pride Month pile of possibilities this year. We'll see how that goes and what my reading is looking like in June, but it would be a natural fit for that. So I will hopefully be getting to it then. I really want to read some of his work. It's just I keep going back and forth about which one I want to do first, and then other things come, shiny little distractions and kind of get in the way. Then we have Love in the Big City by Sang-Young Park. This is a translated novel, but it doesn't say who the translator is on the cover. Anton. I had a feeling, but I didn't want to potentially get it wrong. This was, I believe, on the long list for the Booker International Prize last year and sounded fascinating. So I had requested a copy at my library, I think twice, and nothing was happening. So finally I ordered a copy for myself. And here it is. And I still have not read it, but I would like to. And I'm glad that I have this copy for myself. So whenever I'm ready, it will be here. The final book I brought into my library in April of 2022 was the winner of the International Booker Prize last year, Tomb of Sand by Geetanjali Shree, translated by Daisy Rockwell. It's a brick of a book. It's like the opposite of the Selva Almada book, but I really want to read it. I've heard great things about it. As I said, it was also the winner of the International Booker last year, and I would love to read it. I don't know when I will get around to it, but I would like to. And even though it's taken up a lot of space on my shelf, it is totally fine hanging out there until I get to it. So those were 6 books that I brought into my library in the month of April 2022. I haven't read any of them. But the good news is I haven't unhauled any of them either. And I don't have any plans to unhaul any of them. I mean, even if these books are still sitting here at this time next year, I will still want to read all of them. I feel pretty confident that none of these books will be going anywhere for a long time when it comes to unhauling. They're here for the long haul, no pun intended. I guess except kind of intended. So they will be here, and hopefully I will get to them. There's no danger that they will be going anywhere. Now we get to April of 2021, and things get a little interesting here because the first book that I hauled in that month was Edinburgh by Alexander Chee, which was a book that I had been really looking forward to. I read it, and I hated it. I actually was so angry at the ending that I threw it across the room, which is not something I have done for a lot of books, and I don't recommend it. But anyway, I really didn't like it. So just the idea of kind of keeping it in the house was grossing me out. So it's gone. I don't have it anymore, and I won't look back. And occasionally I almost feel tempted to read another Alexander Chee book, Queen of the Night. And still have such a bad taste in my mouth from this one that it would take a lot to get me to read another one and try again. And it is what it is. Then we have Stories by Helen Garner. This was actually sent to me by Sean the Book Maniac. And a couple of these were that will be coming up. And I have not gotten around to reading it yet, but I am very curious to read Helen Garner's work. And I have been telling myself that I want to read more short stories, but I've been doing that for about a year and I haven't managed to do it yet. So I think it's going to take a concerted project at some point where I'm not going to allow myself to be distracted by other things. So haven't read it, but I would still very much like to. Then we have Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. This was the National Book Award winner, and I don't remember what year, but it won a National Book Award, and it sounded really interesting, and I read it, and I didn't really like it or respond to it, so I didn't feel any need to keep it around, so it is gone. It was a creative book, it was a kind of funny book, but I didn't feel like I needed to have it around on my shelf anymore, so I traded it in, and that, again, it is what it is. But it's not here anymore. That takes us to Libertie by Kaitlyn Greenidge. This had been one of my most anticipated books, I believe, of 2021, the year I hauled it. And I got it, have not gotten around to reading it. And I admit, as time has gone by, we're in my second year having this book, or about to begin my second year having this book in my library. The urgency has really died down, and I feel like I have a lot of other priorities. So I'm going to kind of kick it over to you. If you have read Libertie by Kaitlyn Greenidge, let me know what you thought of it in the comments down below. Because I think if we get to this time next year and it's still here unread, I'm going to probably be starting to think about an unhaul. And that would be a little disappointing because I was really excited about this book and I'd still be curious about it. But the other thing is I really haven't run into anyone who has read this. And I think that's one of the reasons the urgency keeps dying down, because there's nobody stoking the fire of excitement, if that makes sense. So again, if you've read this, let me know what you thought of it, because I'm not going to get rid of it now. But it is potentially heading into the danger zone. And we'll see what happens with that over time. And then there's Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. Sean also sent me this. Joel read this and liked it. I did see the movie when it was released last year. I don't know if I'm going to get around to reading the book at any point. But it's here. And I think this is another one where if it's still here at this time next year, maybe I'll think about doing an unhaul, but it's fine for now. And I know Joel really liked the book. I know a lot of people who have read this and liked it. I have some quibbles with Delia Owens that I haven't really parsed out for myself. And I don't really know how to feel about that yet. So again, if you have feedback about this one, let me know in the comment section down below. I genuinely don't know if I want to read it or not, even though I've heard a lot of really great things about it. And we can leave it at that. The final one from April of 2021 is Cousin Bette. by Honoré de Balzac, a new translation by Sylvia. I don't know if it's new anymore, but it's by Sylvia Raphael. This was the final book that was sent to me by Sean the Book Maniac, and I've never read Balzac, so I figured, I know he's the favorite author of Brian over at Bookish, so I figured this would be a sort of aspirational book to put on my bookshelf. And if I get to it, great. If I don't, hey. I don't know when I would ever read it, but it's here, and it's sort of a library builder in that sense. You know, to me, a library builder is a book you bring into your library without immediate plans to get to, but you'll be happy to have it on your shelf. And maybe someday seeing it on your shelf will say, you know what, maybe I'm in the mood to read that, and I'll take it down and read it. So there wasn't any immediate plan to read it. It was just sort of like a nice, like maybe having a book by Honoré de Balzac in my proximity will increase my odds of reading him at some point in the future. And, you know, in 2 years that has not borne any fruit, but maybe it will in the future. So there were 6 books that I brought into my library in April of 2021. I read 2. Unfortunately, I didn't really like either of them, and I just outright hated one of them. So both of those books are no longer with me. So I brought 6 books into my library, I read 2, and I unhauled 2. And this one, there are 2 of the remaining ones that I'm kind of curious about. So again, if you have feedback on Where the Crawdads Sing or Libertie, let me know in the comment section down below. We're cruising along. Let's get to April of 2020, where I brought 8 books into my library. The first one is A Woman of No Importance, The Untold Story of the American Spy Who Helped Win World War II by Sonia Purnell. I did read this. I read this for the BookTube Prize, in fact, and I really enjoyed this book a lot. It's sort of narrative nonfiction, and it flowed really well. It's a captivating book. It just pulls you in, and it's easy to get lost in it, which is kind of fun. So I did read this one. I enjoy having it on my shelf in my nonfiction section back there, and I will continue to have it for that reason. Then we have The Enlightenment of the Greengage Tree by Shukufeh Azar. I believe this is translated, but I can't remember who it's translated from the Persian. Okay. The translator is anonymous, I believe, for security reasons. I could have that wrong, but I believe that's the case with this. And I want to say this was an International Booker winner, but I could be wrong about that as well. I didn't look it up. And all it says is that it was shortlisted for the Stella Prize on the cover. So, have not gotten around to reading this. At the time I purchased it, it was like a BookTube darling. A lot of people were reading it. A lot of people were liking it. Things have really gone quiet since then. I haven't really heard anyone reading it in the 2 years since. But it's still on my shelf. I would still like to read it, so it's not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. And if I'm ever ready for it, it will be there. Then we have Gachar Gochar, a novella by Vivek Shanbag. This is something I did read, and I didn't love it as much as I had kind of hoped that I would. However, I did like it enough that it's perfectly fine taking up a tiny, tiny, tiny little amount of space on my bookshelves. It was an interesting story. I think I would have preferred it to be developed a little further, like add a couple of pages to it. I think, if I remember right, that was my only little complaint about it. It was a good reading experience. I just kind of wanted a little bit more meat on the bone, so to speak. That takes us to the next 2 books, because they are Volume 1 and Volume 2 of My Brother's Husband by Gengoro Tagame. And there probably is actually a translator on these, but I don't know that it says. Here we go. Translated from the Japanese by Anne Ishii. So I've read both of these, and I loved both of these. This was sort of my attempt to broaden my horizons, and I hadn't really read a manga or an anime book before. So this was my way of doing that, and I loved it. I really loved this book a lot. And if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. I bought Volume 1 thinking I would sort of test it out, the story, and see if I liked it before getting Volume 2. I didn't realize that they're almost intended to be read together. Like and which is funny, because that's something that can irritate me a lot of the time when there isn't really an ending and you're really supposed to go directly into the next volume after reading the first. Usually that irritates me, but in this case it didn't, I guess just because I was really invested in the story of it. So if you are going to get it, I'd say either look for one of those editions that has both volumes in one, or make sure you have both volumes on hand, and I would highly recommend reading it. Joel also read that and really enjoyed it a great deal. And then we have The Man Who Loved Children by Christina Stead. I've heard a lot of really great things about this. So if I remember right, in April of 2020, the world was in lockdown, or maybe not the world, but at least the United States was, because of the pandemic was still new. And I wanted to place orders for books at a local bookstore to help keep them afloat. And that's where I got the Enlightenment, the Greengage, Tree, and Gachar Gochar. And this was another one that I placed in order, kind of an impulse, like what would I like to bring into my library to support a local bookstore. There was a little bit more urgency on those two because of other things. This was more like a library builder. Like, I've heard a lot of really great things about this. I don't have immediate plans to read it. However, I would like to have it in my library, so it will be fine being here. And that's still the case. I would really like to read this at some point. I don't have immediate plans to do so, but I have a nice copy of it, and it'll be perfectly fine hanging out on my shelf until I get to it. And then we have The Guest List by Lucy Foley. I did read this, and I liked it. However, I had a big crunch for space in my library last summer. I've mentioned that a couple of times in recent book haul revisits. And part of that is that I had to make some tough decisions. I was out of space. I had no room for anything. And I had to make some tough decisions. And I kind of looked at this book and I thought to myself, I liked it. Do I need to have it on my shelf? So I made a tough decision and got rid of it, even though I thought it was a kind of fun mystery, which is a good find for me because if you follow along, I have kind of struggled with mystery thrillers for the last few years, basically. And this was one that I read and enjoyed. But I didn't really feel like I needed to keep it on my shelf. So it's not here anymore. And the final book I brought into my library in April of 2020 is Valentine by Elizabeth Wetmore. And this one was nearly a victim of that same purge over the summer. However, if I remember correctly, in my last book haul revisit, I asked for feedback about it because the urgency to read this book had kind of died down, and I wasn't sure I still wanted to, so I kind of asked for anyone watching to leave comments. And there were a lot of really positive comments, so that it got this book a stay of execution. And if not for those comments, when I had that crunch for space last summer, this probably would be gone right now. Here we are another year later, and I still haven't read it, so I don't know. The thing is, I'm not crunched for space because, as you can see, and if you follow along, you already know, we expanded my library in January. So I'm not crunched for space right now. So there isn't really any sense of urgency to get rid of things. However, if by this time next year, things have really filled in a great deal in my library and I am starting to run out of space, this will kind of be back in the danger zone because the more time passes and the more I don't get to it. And this is another one where some of the feedback was like, just be prepared for an emotional wallop. And, I'm not prepared to be emotionally walloped right now. That's not the state that I'm in. So I'll put it to you again. However, with the understanding that it's not going anywhere soon because there's no need to make space for anything. So I'm not going to be getting rid of it imminently. But maybe you can help me bring up the sense of urgency to read this if you would like to, leave a comment down below and let me know why you think I should try to make that book a priority. That takes us to April of 2019. Let me pause for a second while I bend down to grab this pile of books. Oh, actually, I realized I didn't do a wrap up on April of 2020. So there were 8 books that I brought into my library. I've read 5, which is the best I will do in this entire book haul revisit. And I unhauled 1. And it was a book that I had read. And of the remaining books that I have not read, there is a library builder and a book that I would still like to read. And the other one, I'm going to kind of leave it up to you. It's not going anywhere because I don't need space, but let me know what you think. So let's get to April of 2019 now. There were 7 books that I brought into my library. The first one is The Accidental Tourist by Ann Tyler. This edition of it was on sale at my library where they sell used hardcovers for $1. So pretty good find. Ann Tyler is a Pulitzer winner for Breathing Lessons, which is her only book I have read, and I will need to reread it as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. And during the 80s, she wrote a lot of really beloved books that people still talk about. I think Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant is probably the big one, but I've heard really good things about it. I believe this was actually a Pulitzer finalist as well. So I didn't have immediate plans to read it when I brought it into my library. However, it was $1. And she is an author that I'm curious to explore more of, and I will need to reread Breathing Lessons as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. So it's not going anywhere for that reason. And then we have A Pale View of Hills by Kazuo Ishiguro. This jumped onto my radar because I did a video back then, the Choose the Year book tag. I chose the year I was born, and this was published the year I was born, and I hadn't known anything about it. And it sounded really interesting. And I, at the time, had read 2 books by Kazuo Ishiguro and really just loved both of them. I have since read a third and was not as enamored of it. That was Clara and the Sun, which is a bit of a controversial opinion. A lot of people like that book, and that's fine. You're allowed to. I didn't enjoy it anywhere near as much as I did The Remains of the Day or Never Let Me Go. So I haven't read it. I didn't really mean to read it at the time. It was almost like a library builder. Like, I'll have this when I'm in the mood to read it. It's a tiny little thing. You could dunk it in your coffee. So I'll get to it at some point, and will be perfectly fine hanging out on my shelves until I do. Then we have City Boy by Edmund White, My Life in New York During the 1960s and 70s. This is a story about New York City underground gay life in the 60s and 70s, and I would definitely like to read it. I have still not read a book by Edmund White, and I really intend to. This was the one that I had intended to get to first, and now I have a copy of A Boy's Own Story, so I'm kind of constantly torn between which one. I'll probably do A Boy's Own Story first, and then circle back to this one. I almost read this one, but I read Dancer from the Dance, and then once I read that, it was like, I think I should take a little bit of a break from like the gay underground of the 70s because in New York City, because like Dance from the Dance is set in that time period, in that world. So I didn't mean to take as long of a break, but here we are. And I would still like to read City Boy at some point. Then we have Attic by Catherine Dunn, which was sort of an impulse purchase. I saw it in a store, and I read Geek Love when I was in my early 20s and loved it. I don't know that I would feel the same if I read it now. And I didn't realize that Catherine Dunn had anything else that had been published. So without knowing anything about the book, I grabbed it, purchased it, and then did a book haul, and immediately started getting comments from people who were saying that they didn't quite like this. However, it's a really tiny book. So I feel like I've thought about getting rid of it because the feedback was so overwhelmingly negative, but it's such a tiny book that it's not taking up a lot of space. And maybe at some point, I feel like this would be a book maybe on a cold winter afternoon. You need something to do because you're snowed in. Pull this out and you'll read it in one day. So for that reason, I have held on to it, even though I've heard some very negative, mixed to negative things about this book. But it is still here, waiting to be read. And then we have Willa and Hesper, which is another one that has been on a bit of a roller coaster. I feel like this was mentioned by someone on BookTube who has a channel, and I purchased it based off them talking about it. And in the ensuing years, the urgency has really died down to read it, and I've nearly unhauled it several times. In fact, it was taken off my shelf last summer and put in a pile of books to trade in at my local used bookstore. And they didn't take it. They gave me a little note. Like, they would usually put a rubber band around a couple of books and say, all right, try these again. So it was removed from my shelves. I did actually attempt to get rid of it, but they didn't. They said try again. And around January, I looked at that pile and saw this on it. I thought I'd rescue it. So it's back on my shelf. And I don't know if or when I will get around to it. However, it does sound interesting. And since I'm not needing space right now anymore, it's fine hanging out and waiting to see if and when I do get around to it. And if you've read Willa and Hesper, let me know what you thought of it, because I really have not heard anyone else who has read it in the time since. And then we have The Gallery by John Horan Burns. This is an interesting story because I discovered John Horan Burns and The Gallery from a different novel that I didn't finish about Tennessee Williams. In Italy in the 1950s or 60s, he runs into someone named John Horan Burns who had written a novel called The Gallery. And I don't remember what prompted me to realize, oh, this is a real author and a real book that they're talking about. But something did, and I sought it out and bought it, hauled it, and then Jen the librarian saw that, added it to her library, but hasn't gotten around to reading it. And this year for the Queer TBR tackle, she selected it as one of the books that we will be getting to. So hopefully I will finally manage to read this year. And I'll put information to the Queer TBR tackle in the description box down below if you would like to join in on that. The final book I brought into my library in April of 2019 was Karamo, My Story of Embracing Purpose, Healing, and Hope by Karamo Brown. Yes, I did purchase a book, a memoir by one of the Queer Eye guys, and I did read it. I didn't feel like I needed to keep it around. I did think it was a pretty good book, but it was fine. I don't want to oversell it a little bit. It was fine. I didn't feel like I needed to keep it on my shelf, being honest. So I did read it. It's not that I didn't like it, but it's not here anymore either. So that's 7 books that I brought into my library in April of 2019. I've only read 1, which is not great. Again, I've only unhauled 1 though, so that's, I don't know. Is that something? Is it anything? I don't know. Overall, in the past 4 Aprils, I brought 27 books into my library, and I've only read 8. That's not great. That is not great. And although there are a couple of books that I'm really hesitant about whether or not I'm ever going to get around to reading them, there are enough of them that are library builders, and like I said, I'm just not hurting for space right now, so they're not really going to go anywhere. But there are some candidates for an unhaul in the future, and but there are also some books that I would really like to read. So this is not as successful a book haul revisit in terms of the amount of books that I've read, in terms of my desire to read most of them urgently. However, it's a fairly good mix, and it's a learning experience. Part of the whole point of doing these book haul revisits is that it sort of teaches me how I am as a reader and what I'm likely to read if I bring it into my library. And hopefully that makes me a more intentional book purchaser. And, it is what it is. Anyway, I really appreciate your time. I will leave it at that. If you have thoughts about any of the books I've talked about here, or recommendations based on these books or any of the things I've talked about in this, let me know in the comment section down below. I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.